Hello, this is Dr. Andrew Gardner, and today we'll be talking about presidential nominations under the title of Parties and Elections. First of all, what are we talking about when we talk about presidential nominations and political parties? A major function of a political party is to nominate candidates. In fact, that is one of the reasons that they were created during the early days of the United States. As you may know, in America we have two elections. We have a primary election and a general election. A primary election is simply an election to choose the candidates that are going to run under the Republican or the Democratic Party. So it's basically which candidate is going to run as a Republican and which candidate is going to run as a Democrat. These are contested elections like normal general elections, but they're simply to choose the nominees for the parties. For example, in the 2012 primary, the Democrats chose President Barack Obama and the Republicans chose Governor Mitt Romney. The general election is exactly what you think of when you think of normal elections. It is the election to choose the winner, so who will be president, whether it's a Democrat or the Republican. In 2012, you'll remember that the Democratic presidential candidate Barack Obama won and became the president for his second term. Let's talk about some quick background. Presidential nominations are a very long and complicated process. Each state, for instance, holds its own primary elections. Iowa and New Hampshire are usually the first ones to hold their elections, generally around January or February, the year before the election. The purpose of these statewide primaries is to select delegates, and the delegates then go to the party conventions. The party convention formally selects the winner of that party's primary nomination. However, the reality is that the winner is usually known long before then. For example, Governor Mitt Romney had secured the Republican nomination around by the time April came around in 2012. While the formal process is that each state holds a primary contest to select delegates, and the delegates then go on to the party conventions, and the winners formally or officially selected in August of the election year, 2016, in the upcoming election, the reality is that the contest is over months before then. Basically, the candidate with the most delegates is the one that wins. However, each party has different rules, and each state has a different number of delegates. Smaller states typically have fewer delegates, larger states typically have more delegates. And the rules for allocating delegates actually can change from one party to the other and from one state to the other. One important distinction that we're going to make is between caucuses and primaries. Primaries are what you think of as an ordinary election. They just happen well before the general election. Basically, voters go to a polling place, they cast a ballot, and they leave. This is what you'd expect in a general election. And you can see by the picture on the left, this is what they look like. You go to a polling place, you have a ballot, you fill out the ballot, choose the candidate that you want to win, and then leave the polling place. Caucuses, however, are an entirely different beast. The major difference is they're more like a town hall. You can see a picture of the Iowa caucus on the bottom right of the screen. Basically, everybody votes at the same time, and in a lot of these caucuses, voting is actually public. What this means is that caucus goers will raise their hand when their preferred candidate's name is called, and people will informally count the number of hands. We'll talk about another way that caucuses work in a second. But the major difference, again, is simply that everybody votes at the same time. They go to one location, typically a county caucus. It's not everybody in the state getting together, but it is smaller locations. But they all gather. They have to stay there while each candidate's representatives give speeches. And the process typically takes about 3 hours. You can't just walk in and vote and leave. You have to stay there for the entire caucus. It requires much more of a commitment from voters, which is why typically you see lower turnout for caucuses than for primary elections. Let's walk through an illustration for the Iowa caucus, for instance, how it might look in real life. Several states use caucuses. In fact, Wyoming is one of the states that uses a caucus to allocate delegates for the National Convention, and they use a caucus to select their presidential nominees. But we're going to say this is the Iowa caucus. You can see that there are spaces on the right for each candidate's supporters. In some of the caucuses, candidates' supporters actually walk and physically stand in an area in the gymnasium in which the caucus is held to show their support for their candidate. And the number of people standing in each candidate's chosen area is the winner. We limited this to 4. There were many more candidates running in 2012, but we're going to limit it to Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum, Ron Paul, and Newt Gingrich. Now you can see on the left, the smiling faces are caucus goers. They showed up at the caucus location, and I've given them different colors to indicate initial preference for the candidates. Many caucus goers will come in initially preferring Mitt Romney, for instance, but then will switch after hearing speeches from their representatives to another candidate. But let's say in this case that they go through all the speeches. Each candidate gets a representative to speak on their behalf to say why their candidate is the best one. And the Romney supporters walk over and stand in the little box that's been designated for him. And let's say that none of his supporters, in fact, all of the ones that came in initially intending to vote for Governor Romney, ended up voting for him. Now it's Ron Paul's turn. Let's say 3 of his 4 initial supporters end up standing in his location, but this 4th one, he liked what Newt Gingrich's representative has to say, changed his mind at the last minute, and voted for Gingrich. Rick Santorum, all 3 of his supporters go stand in his location, and then Newt Gingrich supporters, one of them ends up walking over to the Newt Gingrich area, but one of them is influenced by the Ron Paul's representative, and let's say she goes over and votes for Ron Paul. Now you can see, just by the number of people standing in each area, that Mitt Romney won this, let's say it's a county caucus, he won this one with 5 votes, and none of the other candidates got as many. And this is about what a caucus looks like. It can be a raucous and very dynamic way of selecting candidates, but it is very different from what you'd normally think of as what we call a primary, which is a normal election with polling booths and ballots. Now, we can start thinking about presidential nominations by thinking about what type of election it's going to be. We're going to talk about 2 scenarios. This is sort of a big macro picture of presidential elections. This is typically things that we know several years before the actual election. The first scenario is when an incumbent president is seeking re-election. Incumbent simply means a current office holder, and so an incumbent president is one that is elected and will be up for re-election the next election cycle. President Obama in 2012 was the incumbent, and so the Republicans were the opposition party. Typically, incumbents are very rarely challenged. They're almost never draw a primary opponent, so they don't even have to contest a primary. They get a free ride all the way through the spring and summer of the election year. And when in the few instances in which they are challenged by an opponent, it usually indicates that the incumbent's in trouble for the general election. So here again, President Obama in 2012 had no primary challenger. That was a very typical year. The opposition party, on the other hand, typically has lots of candidates. You can see in 2012, for instance, Republicans fielded a dozen official candidates, each vying for their party's nomination. The second scenario is what's called an open seat, and that basically means there's no incumbent president seeking re-election. In this situation, both parties typically have a lot of candidates. In 2008, Democrats fielded a total of 8 candidates. And again, Republicans in 2008, which was also an open seat election, also fielded 8 candidates. So both parties, when there's an open seat, you typically draw a lot of different candidates from a lot of different groups within the party trying to get their party's nominee. So let's take one quick digression before we dive right into presidential nominations. It's very important to understand that parties are coalitions of different groups of voters. This is, in fact, one of the purposes of a political party is parties want to win elections, and in order to win elections, they need the majority of support from the public, and so they're going to try to appeal to a lot of different groups to form a coalition to win the majority. On the Democratic side, some of the groups, this is not an all-inclusive list, but some of the groups on the Democratic coalition involve African Americans. Typically 90 to 95% of African Americans vote Democratic. Hispanics and Latinos as well, typically around 55 to 65% depending on the election. And Democrats also draw a lot of support from progressives, from Jewish voters, labor, and especially union members, and people who live on the West Coast and in the Northeast. That's their core base of support. On the Republican side, the Republicans draw a lot of support from those southern states and residents there, and somewhat from the Midwest, especially states like Indiana, across the Midwest with large blue-collar working class population. They also get a lot of support from Christians, especially evangelicals, social conservatives, business, and they also have a libertarian wing. So if you think about the parties in terms of these broad coalitions of different groups, then how we talk about Republican nominations will make a lot more sense. So that brings us to the question that we're really asking. Who wins the nominations and why? We're going to talk about a very famous book written by Marty Cohen, David Carroll, Hans Noel, and John Zoller. The book is called The Party Decides, and if you think about the name, it will give you a big hint as to what the theory is about. We're just going to call it Cohen et al. For now. The theory is intended to explain which candidate is most likely to win each party's nomination. That is the purpose, to figure out which candidates are most likely to win, which candidates are least likely to win, and more importantly, why certain candidates are advantaged and why certain candidates have a disadvantage. One of the most important quotes from the book is this. Cohen et al. Write that, quote, "The primary is essentially a long-running national conversation among members of each party coalition about who can best unite the party and win the next presidential election. There are three parts that are very important, the two parts that are highlighted in blue, and then the two parts that are highlighted in red. First of all, notice as a decision, and the decision is made by party leaders. Counterintuitively, the decision is not made by voters, the people who go to the primary elections or the caucuses. It only appears that they're the ones choosing. We're going to talk about this a lot more in depth, but this is the first and one of the most important aspects of this theory, which is that it's the party coalitions that end up choosing the nominees. The decision involves two main factors. There are two things that the members of the party coalition, the party leaders, think about when they go to select their preferred candidate. The first is who can unite the party. In other words, which candidate has the most appeal to the broadest number of groups within the party coalition. This is why the concept of party coalitions we just talked about is so important. What you need, according to Cohen et al., is a candidate who can appeal to all of those different groups, or as many of them as possible. And second, which candidate can win the election? We often call this electability. Candidates who are most likely to win the general election are going to be preferred by their party. Again, parties want to win. They want to form majority coalitions so that they can win elections and hold power and enact their policy agenda. And so one of the things they're going to look for in their candidate is somebody who can win the general election. They're not very likely to choose somebody they know is going to lose. So let's back up and talk about party leaders. What do we mean by party leaders? These are elected officials, these are donors, these are activists, these are party staffers as well. Often these are the people who are chosen as delegates to go to the party conventions that occur in August. Mainly we're talking about members of Congress, state legislators, party chairs, both county and state chairs, governors, and other notables within the party. We're not talking about average voters, and we're really not talking about very high-level media personalities as well. We're really talking about people who are established in the party who have a stake in the party, either because they're elected or because they work on behalf of the party administration at the county level or what have you. Down in the bottom right, the picture shows delegates to the 2012 Republican National Convention. These are the party activists, these are the state legislators and other state officials who are chosen after the primaries and the caucuses to go and represent the winning candidate. Let's talk about the two factors. First, who can unite the party, and what does that mean? Basically, it means that candidates have to have broad appeal within the party. In other words, they have to appeal to as many different groups as possible. Factional candidates, candidates that only have support from one or a couple of the groups within the party coalition, these candidates rarely win. They just don't have that broad support. Basically what that means is that each group or faction, as we sometimes call them, has an effective veto over the nominee. If two or more groups find a candidate especially unappealing, that candidate has very slim chances of winning the nomination. So this automatically rules out factional candidates such as Representative Ron Paul, who is a favorite among the Libertarian wing of the Republican Party, or Elizabeth Warren, who is a favorite among the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Both are very popular within their respective groups. However, they don't have the broad appeal across the parties, and in fact, some of their positions, such as Senator Warren's position on some economic issues or Representative Paul's position on some foreign policy issues, actually turn off or are not supported by members of the other groups or the other factions. And so these type of candidates very rarely will win the nomination. Notice that the person who ends up winning the nomination is not always the party's favorite candidate. In fact, most of the party leaders have a favorite candidate, but because that candidate only appeals to a certain group or a small number of groups within the party, they will often have to take their second or accept their second most preferred choice. So sometimes the person who wins is just simply the one who is least offensive to everybody. Let's talk about electability. Basically, which candidate is best positioned to win the general election for the party? Again, this criteria automatically rules out ideologically extreme candidates. Now, understand we're talking relative, ideologically extreme relative to the American public, not necessarily relative to the party itself. Basically, candidates that are perceived as being out of the mainstream by most Americans are very unlikely to win the general election and are very unlikely to win, as a result, the primary. This includes candidates such as Bernie Sanders, who is a self-identified socialist. He's a senator from Vermont, registers as an independent but caucuses with a Democrat. The party recognizes that some of his views are outside the mainstream of American politics, and so he would be very unlikely to win the Democratic nominee. Also, Michelle Bachmann, a representative from Minnesota, again, her views are perceived as being outside the mainstream of the American public, especially on some social issues, and so she would be very unlikely to win the Republican nomination. Now, understand that this is not saying that these are bad people. It's not saying that that their policies are in any way bad. You may actually prefer some of these candidates. You may strongly support them and think they make the best president, and they might. The point here is not to denigrate these people. It's simply to recognize that candidates such as these who have factional support or narrow support within the party, or candidates who are not viewed as very electable for the general election, they're just simply less likely to win their party's primaries. And if you go back to the public opinion lecture that I gave, you'll realize why this is the case. Why would the party concern itself with electability? Well, it wants to win, and the American public's simply not ideological. And so the American public is going to be put off by very ideologically extreme candidates. Second, the electability factor also rules out candidates who are weak on fundraising or don't have as dynamic a personality. Very rarely will somebody with an absolutely flat personality win their nominee. It has to be people who will rally the base and who can inspire the American public during the course of the presidential election in the fall. And that requires money, and candidates need to be able to show the party that they can raise enough money to pay for the ads and all the other things that they feel they need for the election. And finally, it would obviously rule out scandal-ridden candidates. A candidate that is mired in a scandal is going to put off a lot of voters in the general election. It's going to not be viewed as electable as other candidates. All of this is a way to say that parties almost never nominate somebody who has zero chance of winning the general election. Again, it'd be kind of dumb if the party did nominate somebody that they knew couldn't win. Their goal every election season is to win the presidency, and it's to enact their policy agenda, and they can only do that by winning the presidential election. And so that's one of the reasons that the party leaders take into account the candidate's electability when they choose their nominee. So let's go back and do a quick summary. Cohen et al. Have a theory about who wins presidential nominations and who does not. And their theory starts with the realization that nominations are decisions made by the party leaders, the activists and the elected officials within the party. And the candidates who win are those who can best unite the party, who can appeal broadly to the different factions within the party, and also those who are best positioned to win the general election in November. So it's a simple little theory, but it has some powerful implications that we're going to talk about later. First, though, let's go back to that party leaders thing. This is one of the most counterintuitive and strange notions. The idea is that voters do not determine the nominations. It is not the voters who are really the ones selecting the candidates. And yet, we have these primaries and caucuses in every state, in which voters show up either at a regular polling place and cast ballots for their preferred candidate, or they show up at a caucus and they vote for their preferred candidates. So what's really going on here? Well, the theory is that party leaders influence voters, and this is one of the main causal mechanisms behind this. The party leaders who go out and support a candidate for the president's nomination will then go campaign on behalf of the candidates and will persuade the voters. So candidates have to woo the party leaders, and the party leaders then influence their supporters, the voters. So the idea is that we take the normal dynamic of an election, the voters choosing the candidates, and flip it on its head. It's the candidates appealing to the party leaders, and the party leaders persuading the voters to support that candidate ahead of the primary election. Supporters in this case follow the party leaders' endorsement, and the endorsement aspect of it is very, very important to Cohen et al.'s theory. For them, the endorsement is a signal to other members of the party coalition that a candidate is acceptable or not. And then the party leader is able to then go, because they're an elected official, for instance, a state legislator, they have influence with the voters and will then go persuade the voters to, in the primary election, to support the candidate they have endorsed. So let's walk through the dynamics of this with another fun graphic. What we have here at the bottom in this big cloud are the voters. So these are the voters, let's say, in a particular state, who have to choose during the primaries or the caucuses which candidate they're going to support. Between them, the slightly bigger smiley faces are the party leaders. Again, these are state legislators, these are county party chairs, these are sometimes members of Congress, governors, but mainly it's the party leaders, the people in the party who have a stake in it. And then the giant heads at the very top, these are the candidates. There are 3 candidates in our mock election. However, this is a more appropriate view because each party leader has influence over some smaller number of voters. And so what the party leader wants to do is to win the support of the largest number of party leaders, each one of whom is associated with a different group or faction within the party, and thereby appeal broadly and let the party leaders do the campaigning on their behalf with the voters. So let's say our blue candidate over to the far right says, I'm the bestest candidate in the world, the party should choose me. And he goes to the state, let's say Iowa or New Hampshire or any state, he goes to the state and he starts talking to these party leaders. And he tries to convince them that he's the bestest candidate in the whole world. If he's successful, then the party leaders will support him, and they'll flip their support and say, come out and endorse him publicly, and say, he's a swell guy, he's the bestest candidate in the history of forever. And then the party leaders, in turn, go and influence the voters over whom they have influence to support their endorsed candidate. And the voters, in turn, look to the party leaders in the middle, and especially their endorsements, as hints about which candidate is best for their group. Of course, our candidate over here, our medium blue candidate, is not the only candidate. The other candidates are doing the same thing. So our candidate on the left is saying, no, I am the bestest candidate in the history of forever. And maybe he's able to convince a couple of party leaders to endorse him, and that in turn signals to the voters over whom the party leaders have influence that he's the best candidate, and so they agree to vote for him. Of course, the other candidate comes back and he's going to go back to the state and try to win some of the remaining party leaders and get their endorsements. Let's say that they agree with him, so they come over and support him, and their voters become his voters. Now, oftentimes, the party leaders, the activists, and the elected officials will hold off endorsing a candidate, and oftentimes they'll wait to see which candidate's winning that broad support and then jump on board. That leaves our blue voter or blue party leader in the middle here in something of a pickle, because now he has to choose a candidate. He looks over and sees that one candidate, the candidate on the right, has the most support, and so oftentimes a party leader or a ranking member of the party will flip his support and join and get on the bandwagon. Of course, that leaves our candidate here in the middle without any support. What does that candidate do? Well, a lot of times early on during the primaries and the caucuses, realizing that that candidate can't win, will flip over and support the candidate that has the majority of support. You can see visually how quickly a candidate can rack up majority support within the party and rally and unite the party around him or her. And the candidates that are best able to do that, to convince a broad range of party leaders to endorse him or her, and then influence their voters to do the same, that candidate becomes much more likely to win. So, as our little figure here shows, it is very much a top-down process. It is why the book is called The Party Decides. Candidates have to go and convince the party leaders to endorse them, and then the party leaders endorse the candidate, and it signals to the other party leaders that that candidate is acceptable to their group or their faction. The party leaders then campaign for the candidates to persuade the voters. These are their supporters, the people oftentimes who voted for the party leader, the state legislator, in the last election. So they're going to, the party leader, the elected official, is going to have influence over the voters and uses that influence to persuade them to support their candidate. So again, it is a two-step process. The candidate has to convince the party leaders, the party leader has to endorse the candidate, and then the voters follow the signals and the endorsements of the party leader. So if you want to know who's really ahead in the primary elections, oftentimes you should ignore the polls, especially very early on, because a lot of times the polls are not picking up on the actual dynamic of the campaign. You want to look at endorsements by party leaders. Again, it's a better signal about which candidate is able to rally and unite the base and which candidate the party itself thinks is the best person to win the general election. However, it is not just the number of endorsements that the candidate gets. Again, the dynamic here is that party leaders want to know who will unite the party and all of the factions. So you want to look for endorsements from a lot of different factions at the same time. It indicates broad support within the party. In 2012, Governor Romney was able to do this very effectively. While the polls showed various candidates leading the top of the pack, while one candidate would rise and then fall a month later, you had this dynamic where each month the polls showed a new candidate who wasn't Governor Romney in the lead. Throughout the whole thing, Governor Romney was able to win the endorsements of a large number of party leaders across the spectrum, social conservatives, economic conservatives, even a few libertarians, so forth and so on. And by the time the actual campaigns came around and the actual elections in January, February, and March, Governor Romney had that broad party support and was able to quickly translate that into wins in the primaries and caucuses and secured the nomination fairly early on. So let's talk about one last quick digression. Cohen et al.'s theory is a little more complicated and a little more nuanced than this. In particular, they argue that party leaders have private conversations with one another. It's not always a public discussion. When they endorse a candidate, that is a public signal to everybody else within the party about who they think is acceptable. But before any of the elections actually occur, the state legislators, the party chairs, the party officials within that state will actually have informal conversations with one another about who they think is the best candidate to represent the party in the general election. So it's a way of forming agreement among themselves, which then translates into the endorsements for the candidate. What this means, and the reason that the book is called The Party Decides, is that candidates are chosen behind the scenes. During the old days, before the 1970s reforms that led to all of these primaries and caucuses, all of these primary elections, used to be the party leaders would formally select or endorse the delegates for each candidate. They would select the candidate's winner, and it was criticized pretty harshly, especially by the progressive movement, as being smoke-filled rooms of secretive deal-making that was choosing the nominees. It was viewed as very corrupt. One of the important consequences or implications of Cohen et al.'s theory is that not much has changed actually in the dynamics of party nominees, that it's still the party leaders who are making the choices, and that the primaries and the caucuses have less of an impact than what we thought they would. So once again, the endorsements by the party leaders are a signal to other party leaders. That's part of the conversation. They have informal conversation behind the scenes and then have public signals to one another. So it's not just about convincing voters and supporters. Part of the party leaders' goals are to convince other party leaders to get on board. It's another way of saying it's still a very elite-driven and party-driven process. It's not the reforms in the 1970s did not have the democratizing effect that the people who enacted them thought it would. So not much has really changed since the 1970s reforms. Now, you'll sometimes see this process referred to as the invisible primary. The invisible primary simply means it happens behind the scenes, and the media doesn't cover this conversation very well. You don't see a lot of the cable news or the news networks talking about the delegate selections or the conversations that are going on among party leaders. They're really focused on the elections, the primaries, and the caucuses themselves. And that's where their focus lies. And as Cohen et al. Tell us, that the real action, the real choice is being made before that happens. And so, again, it's sometimes referred to as the invisible primary. So, what does this theory have to tell us about 2016? Here's a brief timeline of how 2016 elections will play out. The invisible primary typically begins sometime around August the previous year. So for the 2016 election, start paying attention around August 2015. That's when Iowa has its Ames straw poll, and this is sort of the quasi-official kickoff to the presidential nominating season. After that, you'll see for the several months following the straw poll, you'll have debates among some of the candidates, very public forums. But this is where the candidates spend most of their time going state to state and trying to rally the support of the party leaders to get their endorsements. Now, all of the candidates right now who are thinking about running for office in January 2015 are actually visiting those states as well and trying to influence the support. But the real action starts around August 2015. There are some early possibilities of candidates who might run. On the Democratic side, almost certainly Hillary Clinton is looking into an election. Joe Biden is another candidate who might throw his name in the ring, and Jim Webb from Virginia has also formally created what's called an exploratory committee. It's the first step towards actually running. So these are likely possibilities on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, you have Mitt Romney, who ran in 2012. You have Jeb Bush, brother of former President George Bush. And you have Rick Perry, former governor of Texas as well. He ran in 2012. So these are people who might run as well. These are possible candidates to look at to see if they officially decide to run for their party's nomination. However, it's very important to understand this is not a definitive list. Again, 2016 is going to be an open seat election. President Obama is retiring. He served 2 terms. Presidents can only serve 8 years. His 8 years are up, and so there's not going to be an incumbent president seeking re-election. What that means, you're going to have a lot of candidates on both sides. Democrats are probably going to field between 4 to 12 candidates, and Republicans could field 4 to 12 candidates as well. So you're going to have a lot of candidates on both sides. So we don't know yet who's going to get involved. Moving into November and December of 2015, you have what's called a winnowing process. Some of the candidates will drop out. They're going to realize they just can't win, or a lot of times they simply run out of money. The donors are donating to certain candidates. That dries up the pool of money available to the others, and they don't have the money to travel to the different states, and so they drop out. And typically, when a candidate drops out, they will then endorse another candidate. This process continues through January and February during the early primaries and caucuses. You see typically a lot of candidates drop out during this period. Either they do not win the Iowa caucus or they do not win the New Hampshire primary. Their funding dries up and they're forced to drop out of the race and then endorse one of the candidates that's still in there. So again, look at the endorsements, not just from candidates who drop out, but look at endorsements from members of Congress, state legislators, and other party notables. The candidate, again, who gets the most endorsements from the broadest range of party leaders is going to be the candidate that's very likely to win. And finally, around the end of March or the beginning of April, you typically know who the winner is going to be. Almost every presidential primary election is decided before even the middle of April. There are some exceptions. 2008 Democratic primary lingered on for a while between Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and then Senator, now President Barack Obama. But typically the winner's known, and if the winner's not known at that point, the contest will be down to only two candidates. The party, what that means is that the party is pretty much evenly split between two perfectly acceptable candidates, and they just can't choose between those. There's no obvious choice. Again, we saw this in 2008 where the Democratic Party was split between Clinton and Obama, but most contests were like the Republican nomination in 2012 where it quickly became apparent that Governor Romney was the obvious choice for the party. The party coalesced behind him, and he won very quickly. So that's to say that's actually a very fast process. It can be long and complicated formally, but in reality, the politics of it are that by the time about half of the primaries and caucuses have been held, a clear winner has pretty much emerged, or it's pretty obvious as a choice between two candidates. Again, 2016 is an open seat. There's no incumbent, which means lots of candidates. Both parties probably going to have at least 4 to 5 candidates and could have more than 10. A couple of caveats, though, to keep in mind. When we talk about a candidate being most likely, that does not mean that candidate will absolutely positively win. This is, after all, a probabilistic theory. Then all we can say is that this candidate is favored or has an advantage and most of the time will win the election. But there are surprises. It is politics. Stranger things have happened. And when we say that a candidate is least likely, we do not mean that the candidate is a bad person. We don't mean that the candidate has bad policies. What we mean is simply that the candidate, for either because they lack the broad appeal across all of the factions of the party, or because they're viewed as not, for whatever reason, not being very electable for the general election, they just aren't likely to get a lot of endorsements and a lot of support across the party, which means they're not likely to win the primaries. And finally, I hope the goal that I have for this lecture is that you'll have some tools to objectively analyze the presidential race heading into 2016 and beyond. This theory is widely applicable across elections. We can look back to 2012 and 2008 and understand why Governor Romney in 2012 won the party nomination. We can understand why Senator McCain in 2008 won the Republican nomination, why Senator Barack Obama won the Democratic nomination. But we can also look ahead and get some insight into which candidates are probably not going to go very far and which candidates have lasting power. But most important, you have to put your personal beliefs aside when analyzing this. You may really like Ron Paul. You may really like Elizabeth Warren. You may think they'll be the best president. And again, maybe one of them would be. But the point here is that for various reasons, neither one of those candidates is very likely to win the nomination and therefore to become president. And again, it doesn't mean that either one are bad people or that their policies are inherently bad. It just means that they lack broad appeal within the party or they're viewed as not as electable for the general election. And therefore the party leaders don't choose them. So I hope that what I've given you is a couple of tools to analyze the upcoming election, to understand why recent nomination contests have concluded the way they have. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.